going to scoot up a little bit more. All right. What did y'all think of our topic tonight? In the main verse, compromise.
Flies and perfume.
Flies and perfume. That is quite a VBS topic. But I think it's good. Our kids will get a whole different type of VBS than we got growing up. So. Yeah. That's funny. I hope that's not where Lynn gets all of her perfume. Okay, good. Let's go ahead and turn over to Ecclesiastes chapter 10, verse 1. So I just titled tonight, by the way, how much time do we have in? Do you really know, Cindy, or are you just saying that?
I just had to do that. The last session starts at 7:45.
Oh, 7:45. Okay. All right. I'll do the math. All right. So we've got about 50 minutes. That'll be good. We'll start at Ecclesiastes chapter 10, verse 1. And like I said, I entitled tonight, Don't Compromise, right? We're talking about compromising. And I was thinking about this yesterday as I was putting some notes together on this, and was really thinking about, what actually makes us compromise sometimes? Like, why do we compromise? And does compromise have only negative connotations? I think the answer to that is no. A lot of times we think of compromise as a good thing, right? That's how to make a healthy marriage. A lot of times is understanding when to compromise. Larry and Debbie, you guys spend a lot of time together. I'm sure, Larry, you compromise quite a bit. Okay. Yes, where you eat. That's a safe statement, Larry. That's good. So there are times, too, when we compromise when we really shouldn't. And one of the other things I thought about was, compromise isn't always bad, but when we do compromise, speaking for me, sometimes I don't even realize I'm compromising sometimes. You're kind of, you're stuck in a situation where you're surprised by something, and so there's some give and take. I do this a lot at work, where I'm presented with a problem. A lot of times when you're presented with a problem, you find yourself compromising, or you're trying to decide something between two people. And I don't know what it is about human nature. We always want to be real careful about being like, well, this person's 100% correct and you're 0% correct, right? And we find ourselves compromising a lot of times. And then it gets us in trouble because I think that's one of the drivers behind compromising is if I compromise, I don't have to make a solid stand here. What do you think? Why do we compromise sometimes in the way that we do? Yeah, rather than fight the fight. That goes right along with my thinking there. Sometimes it's easier to just compromise. Yeah, that's right. Which is interesting. That reminds me of Solomon, and one of the prime examples we have of Solomon's ability to discern and be wise is him taking a stand between two women that were having a conflict. Right? We see that in one of our passages tonight that we'll get to here in a moment. But all those things are not really what Solomon dealt with whenever he found himself compromising against God's will. It wasn't necessarily to make other people happy, and it really wasn't necessarily him trying to make this big decision. He understood God's will, and he really found his compromising state to be just drifting away from it. just in different ways and different reasons, all the way from how sacrifices should be made and how worship should be done to God, to the relationships that he had. And he had a lot. And it was a way in which he moved away from what God's will really is. Ecclesiastes chapter 10, verse 1. Dead flies make the perfumer's ointment give off a stench. So a little folly outweighs wisdom and honor. Let's define folly. Let's start just by defining what is meant by folly in this verse. I think really what we're thinking about here is sinful act, things that are unwise, foolish. That's what is meant by folly. And I was really going to work to define this passage, and then Will did so in his typical eloquent way. You really did. It was a great definition of how this verse works. Just a little bit will ruin such a great thing. You can work your whole life and fall short in one moment, or you can work a whole career and fall short in one moment, or you can spend so much time with a child that you're bringing up in your home and devote so much time and then lose something in just a brief moment. That's a lot in how our relationship with God is we can fall short and stay in that posture, and it just ruin the whole picture, right? That's really what Solomon is trying to portray to us, and he would know better than anyone what he's talking about here and what is meant here. So it's a verse that when I first read it, I had to read it a couple of times to get it to sink into my thick head. But it really is powerful. And we see nuances of this in the New Testament. We'll flip to that in a moment. We see an example in 1 Corinthians of a situation just like this, which is a whole church that has decided to compromise over one matter. And I think it had to do with making a stand. And they essentially let that influence everything else. That's another way that I think you can think about this verse is how much a little bit of folly can influence the whole matter, whatever it might be. So a great thing to think about. Let's dive into to Solomon. We're going to look at just a few chapters out of 1 Kings, if you want to be making your way over to 1 Kings. We're going to start in chapter 3. Solomon at this point is just anointed king, and we'll see what he does as soon as we pick up on the story of Solomon. He already begins to make a compromise into what God wants for his people. We're going to look at chapter 3, and then we're going to flip over to chapter 9, and then we're going to end in looking at chapter 11 as we dive into to Solomon. So the first thing we read about Solomon, first of all, in verses 1 and 2 of chapter 3, we see that Solomon made a marriage alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and he took Pharaoh's daughter and brought her into the city of David until he had finished building his own house and the house of the Lord and the wall around Jerusalem. Now, what's the problem with that? I said it was a compromising situation, how Solomon first started out. What's the problem? Wrong wife. That's simply put, but correct. Wrong wife. God at this time didn't want his people intermarrying with other nations, right? And so just as soon as we start learning more about Solomon, we see that he has this problem, and he's going against God's will. But we also learn other things about Solomon. Look at verse 3. Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of David his father. Only he sacrificed and made offerings at the high places. Okay, so in just verses, let's read verse 4 as well. And the king went to Gibeon to sacrifice there, for that was the great high place. Solomon used to offer 1,000 burnt offerings on that altar. Okay, so we learn a little bit more about Solomon. First of all, he is apt to do what he wants to do sometimes. But what else do we learn about Solomon? First thing in verse 3. He loved the Lord, right? We know that he really had his mind on God. The problem was he wasn't always in accordance with God's will. We see a very conflicted person here. And I think a lot of times when you read about David and when you read about Solomon, you read things like all the concubines and all the wives and David falling short with Bathsheba. You think, well, wait a minute, these people. I've always grown up at VBS thinking that David and Solomon were like the ideal kings, and they were people after God's own heart, and that's how we're to think about them. And then you run into these situations, and it's tough, but it also serves as an example to us. One is that when you have a heart for God, when you truly love God, that will help you find your way, right? That's one way that you can make sure you're a true follower of God, even when you fall short. So we read this about Solomon, that he loved the Lord, and there was no doubt about this. In verse 1, we found one challenge that Solomon had. In verses 2 through 3, there's another piece of information we get about Solomon that God did not smile upon. What do we learn about Solomon? Did it jump out to you? Yeah.
It was worshiping in high places.
Okay.
And the high places, that they thought that was getting closer to God.
Yeah.
And you don't get closer to God by crawling up a mountain.
Right.
God didn't like it. But all of the pagan worshipers worshiped on high
Yeah.
hills and that kind of stuff. So I see this as Solomon's first step towards easing into
Right.
pagan worship.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's perfect. That's the thing you should catch here is that yes, Solomon had a problem with intermarrying with other nations, but he also didn't follow God's process for worship and what God wanted for worship. And just like you said, James, he followed really what the pagan worshipers were doing. And did he really put everything he had into worship? Look back at our passage here.
1,000 burnt offerings.
Yeah, 1,000 burnt offerings. So in true Solomon fashion, he put everything that he had into it, right? 1,000 burnt offerings seems like a lot of burnt offerings to me, like 1,000. That's a lot. So it's not like he wasn't in on the worship. He just wasn't doing it in the way that God wanted him to do it.
Did he kill 120,000 at the temple when it was built?
Yeah, we're going to look at that here in just a bit. Yeah, so you see a lot of highs and lows. Now, just as we focus on this particular passage, there's some things that we can take away from it, things that we haven't fully covered already. What, in God's eyes, what is partial obedience? Because this is what we see from Solomon. We essentially see partial obedience. Worship God. Okay, I'm going to worship God in my own way. He's king and he's married, but he does it in his own way. So how do we look at that? How do you think God defines partial obedience?
I don't think he does.
Disobedience, right? That's what partial obedience is disobedience. So that's one of the biggest pieces of this that we should take away from this passage. Partial obedience in God's eyes is disobedience, right? That's something that we grapple with a lot in our culture today. because we live in a world of relativity. Everything around us is, it depends, or maybe you're not looking at it in the right way, or, well, that's okay that you feel this way, but these people feel this way, and so, accept all the things, right? But from God's perspective and in what God wants and what we should do as someone that loves God, like Solomon loved God, is fully obey. That's how to get 100% obedience and stay out of things like partial obedience. Secondly, when we blend devotion with worldly tactics, we begin to drift away from full-hearted worship. And that's another picture that we get from Solomon. That's what you were talking about, James, is we see a begin from Solomon to slide away from what God really wants and what God expects in worship. James chapter 1 verse 8 says, "A double-minded man is unstable in all his ways." It doesn't say a double-minded man is unstable in half of his ways. It says he's unstable in all of his ways. And that's the picture that we get from Solomon. So that particular section I just think of as how small compromises ultimately erode and de-evolve devotion that we have to God. So something for us to be very watchful of. Any comments, questions about that particular section? We're going to look here in just a bit in the latter part of chapter 3.
The cliche is it's a slippery slope.
Yeah.
Step off.
Yeah.
It's easy to.
Yeah, just keep going.
What happened to Solomon? Started with little baby steps and
Yeah.
wholeheartedly.
Yep. It's a good point. It's a really good point.
When you look at Nadab and Abihu, they worship in their own way.
That's right.
They got destroyed.
It's a great analogy to what was happening with Solomon, Nadab and Abihu. All right, let's look at verses 5 through 14. With everything that Solomon was doing, he still goes to God and prays to God. Look at 5 through 14. At Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream by night, and God said, "Ask what I shall give you." And Solomon said, "You have shown great and steadfast love to your servant David, my father, because he walked before you in faithfulness and righteousness and in uprightness of heart towards you. And you have kept for him this great and steadfast love, and have given him a son to sit on his throne this day. And now, O Lord my God, you have made your servant king in place of David, my father. Although I am but a little child, I do not know how to go out or come in. And your servant is in the midst of your people whom you have chosen, a great people, too many to be numbered or counted for multitude. Give your servant therefore an understanding mind to govern your people, that I may discern between good and evil. For who is able to govern this your great people?" All right, we get a new picture of Solomon. So in the previous picture of Solomon, what I had in my mind is this man who was the son of a king, who is going to come into the kingdom, marry whoever he wants to marry, worship however he wants to worship. And then God comes to Solomon, and God says what to Solomon? What does God say in this passage? That's right. Everybody knows you're supposed to wish for more wishes. But Solomon didn't do that. We get a picture of Solomon, and in my mind, it immediately flips around to what I was thinking of Solomon. You see this picture of this the most humble person you could think of, right? He says things like, "I'm a little child, who am I to govern these people?" And then what does he ask for God? Within that context, he comes to God and asks for what? Wisdom. He says, "Please give me discernment that I can help govern these people that I'm just as a little child am now king of." You get a new respect for Solomon. So you read all these things in the first part of the passage, and then you come upon this and you're like, whoa, he's not the king I thought he was. He's approaching things in the right way. Say it one more time, James.
Might have been a little wise.
Yeah. Yeah, we see some true wisdom from Solomon here in chapter 3, starting in verse 5. Let's pick up back in verse 10. It pleased the Lord that Solomon had asked this, and God said to him, because you have asked this, and you have not asked for yourself long life or riches or the life of your enemies, but have asked for yourself understanding to discern what is right, behold, I now do according to your word. Behold, I give you a wise and discerning mind, so that none like you has been before you, and none like you shall arise after you. And then he layers on top of that, right? Look at verse 13. I give you also what you have not asked, both riches and honor, so that no other king shall compare with you all your days. And if you will walk in my ways, keeping my statutes and my commandments, as your father David walked, then I will lengthen your days. And then Solomon woke up, right? His engagement with God had ended at that point. Really amazing to see this interchange between God and Solomon. And this is not the last time that Solomon's going to have a direct correspondence with God. We're going to see it later in chapter 9. But we see what God is doing here. What are we to think about this particular situation? So just like we reviewed, Solomon, and how do we apply it to our lives? So Solomon had kind of done whatever he wants to do in the early part of chapter 3, and then all of a sudden God comes to Solomon and says, whatever you want, just ask for it. How do we apply that to our lives? This is one thing we ask ourselves all the time.
God answers prayers.
Okay, God answers prayers. Okay, yeah, because God came to Solomon and asked him what he wanted. Solomon gave him a sincere answer, and Solomon received it, plus more, right?
James says if we don't have wisdom because we do not ask.
Yeah.
This is a very good example of asking for wisdom.
Yeah. Yeah, that's another thing that I had thought of whenever I was looking through this, is this very thing. Consider this too. Romans 2, verse 4 says, Paul says, do you presume on the riches of his kindness, not knowing that God's kindness is meant to lead you to repentance? Okay, that's a little bit of the situation with Solomon too. If you first read through this and kind of skate by everything, you're like, wait a minute, Solomon does these things that he shouldn't do, and then God comes to Solomon and says, let me know what you want and I'll give it to you. And then that happens, right? We shouldn't always think that someone leading a blessed life is also leading an ideal life. Because then that puts us in a bad spot, right? Whenever we intersect with those type of things and we start asking the questions, how come good things happen to bad people? Or how come good things happen when some people do bad things, right? And so we shouldn't always presume, like it says in Romans, that God blesses only good people. All people are blessed in all different ways. And Solomon was blessed in this way, even though he had done things that he shouldn't have done and will continue to do things that he shouldn't do. All right, we're going to move on from chapter 3. Later on, Solomon shows his wisdom off. So the two ladies come up to him with the baby and says, this baby's mine, and the other one says, this baby's mine, and Solomon gets a very wise judgment on the whole situation, and you really see everything that Solomon does in that way. But we're going to move on to chapter 9, because we're going to focus on Solomon's behavior and his relationship with God. So you see a lot in between here, what all happens with God's people. But we're going to pick up back over to chapter 9. And we have another visitation from God in chapter 9. Let's look at chapter 9, verses 10 through... So this is after the Lord appears to Solomon. We're going to pick up at verse 10 of chapter 9. At the end of 20 years in which Solomon had built the two houses, the house of the Lord and the king's house, And Hiram, king of Tyre, had supplied Solomon with cedar and cypress timber and gold, as much as he desired. King Solomon gave to Hiram 20 cities in the land of Galilee. But when Hiram came from Tyre to see the cities that Solomon had given him, they did not please him. Therefore he said, "What kind of cities are these that you have given me, my brother?" So they are called the land of Kabul to this day. Hiram had sent to the king 120 talents of gold. And this is the amount of the forced labor that King Solomon drafted to build the house of the Lord and his own house, and the Millo, and the wall of Jerusalem, and Hazar, and Megiddo, and Gezer. Pharaoh, king of Egypt, had gone up and captured Gezer and burned it with fire, and had killed the Canaanites who lived in the city, and had given it as dowry to his daughter, Solomon's wife. So Solomon rebuilt Gezer and Lower Beth-horon. I'm not going to keep reading that because you get to see everything that Solomon did. And I was doing pretty good with names. I'm just going to stop while I'm ahead. But you see everything that Solomon did from the perspective of Hiram. What was Solomon to Hiram? He's a little bit of a swindler to Hiram, right? Hiram exchanged some goods for some cities, and you think, how many cities were there? 20? Did I count 20? See 24 cities? But you had an exchange of cities, and that was part of the payment to Hiram. And Hiram goes and looks at the cities, and he says, "These cities ain't for me. What's going on here?" Solomon was able at this point to amass all kinds of wealth, alliances, and prestige. Look all the way over to verse 24. Remember Pharaoh's daughter, who Solomon married in chapter 3, in the early part of chapter 3. Look what type of drift is happening. But Pharaoh's daughter went up from the city of David to her own house that Solomon had built for her. Then he built the Millo. Okay, you see Solomon beginning to really spread out his kingdom and his wealth and everything that God has blessed him with. He's intermarried with other nations, so much so that he now has different houses for his wives. Pharaoh's daughter being one of those. And you see more concerns for appearance and all the possessions that Solomon has than you would see for God. And so you see Solomon beginning to drift more and more away from having a heart for God and more so around having a heart for appearance and blessings. It reminds us about Jesus' words in Matthew 6, verse 21, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. This is the state that Solomon is getting into, is the state of idolatry and wealth accumulation. Last of all, we're going to flip over to 1 Kings chapter 11, and we're going to look at verses 1 through 8. In this area, Solomon is going to be fully compromised into corruption. Okay, so we see the corrupt nature of King Solomon. Now, King Solomon loved many foreign women, along with the daughter of Pharaoh. So I guess he still loved the daughter of Pharaoh. I guess that's okay. Now he loves many foreign women in verse 1. Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, and Hittite women, from the nations concerning which the Lord had said to the people of Israel, "You should not enter into marriage with them, neither shall they with you, for surely they will turn away your heart after their gods." Solomon clung to these in love. He had 700 wives who were princesses and 300 concubines, and his wives turned away his heart. For when Solomon was old, his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not wholly true to the Lord his God, as was the heart of David his father. For Solomon went after Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and after Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. So Solomon did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and did not wholly follow the Lord as David his father had done. Then Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, and for Molech, and the abomination of the Ammonites, in the mountains east of Jerusalem. And so he did for all his foreign wives, who made offerings and sacrifices to their gods. One thing that really sticks out to me here is what we read about Solomon and where his heart is in chapter 3. Remember what Solomon's heart was all about in chapter 3? He had the heart for God, right? It's one thing we read about earlier on. Look what has happened to his heart here now in chapter 11. It's really ran away. And here in 1 Kings we read that in his old age his wives turned away his heart after other gods. You see a hard transition of Solomon's heart and how it's moved away from this. You see also what's really interesting is in chapter 3 you see the things that he fell short on. It's really two things that were listed. He married Pharaoh's daughter. And what was the other one? Worship in the high places. Look what he's doing in chapter 11. What are the two things that he's falling short on? Marrying foreign women. He's worshiping in the high places. Except now he's multiplied it by 100. So if there's ever a lesson on the problems with compromising and to James's point, drifting away and how it's a slippery slope, to your point, Jimmy, earlier, this is it. You can look at chapter 3 and just see a couple of steps away from where he should be, and now you're in chapter 11, and he is all over the place. That's what compromise can do to us in our corrupted state. Ultimately, what begins as tolerated sin becomes accommodated and eventually just brash, celebrated sin, and we see that from Solomon. And I think it's also interesting that you see, as you read in 1 Kings chapter 11, you see that Solomon is in his old age now, right? And just the amount of time and the amount of compromise that built up over the years, you see a young Solomon and an old Solomon. We're going to look at this in detail here in just a little bit, but a cross-reference of the passage we're going to look at is Galatians 5, chapter 9. It's really close to what Ecclesiastes chapter 10, verse 1 says to us. Galatians 5:9 says, a little leaven leavens the whole lump. Kevin, you're a baker, right? Or you talk about baking all the time. What does leaven do? Do you ever bake with... I'm not a baker at all, so I don't know much about it. But I know that leaven makes the bread rise, right? Yeah, yes. Yeah, same thing. Makes the bread rise as you're baking. Some of you may be like big-time bakers like Kevin. You're rolling your eyes as I try to explain this. But you see, Bob's a baker. Bob the baker. You see what influence can do in such a large part. Well, that's what we're reading about here in Galatians. I also love Proverbs 4:23. It says, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. It's a beautiful passage, especially as you compare it to what happened to Solomon. In chapter 3, his heart was aligned with God. He didn't guard his heart, right? His heart then went to 700 concubines and 300 wives. That's where his heart went to. He did not guard his heart. So as a result, we see the examples of consequences in later on in chapter 9. If you just look at some of the subtext above the paragraphs, mine says, the Lord raises adversaries. This was God's way always of taming people, specifically leaders that were not aligned with Him. Look at verse 9. And the Lord was angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice and had commanded him concerning this thing, that he should not go after the other gods. But he did not keep what the Lord commanded. Therefore the Lord said to Solomon, since this has been your practice, and you have not kept my covenant and my statutes that I have commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom from you and will give it to your servant. Yet for the sake of your father, I will not do it in your days, but I will tear it out of the hands of your son. However, I will not tear it away all the kingdom, but I will give one tribe to your son for the sake of David, by my servant, and for the sake of Jerusalem that I have chosen. And so you see a divided kingdom on the horizon because of Solomon's sinful acts. I think the thing that probably had to have hurt Solomon the most is of all the things that David went through, he was still a man after God's own heart, right? And then just looking at the way this is written, the comparisons to David, Solomon didn't have the heart of David, where all Solomon's heart went. That had to be one of the most devastating things to Solomon as a person, to know that not only did he disappoint his father, but he disappointed God, and he didn't live in the way that he should have. And so you see all of this happening throughout chapter 11. God's angry. The kingdom is ultimately torn apart. And Jeroboam comes in and is a rival to Solomon, and ultimately the Israelite kingdom is torn apart. Last of all, we see God's grace remaining. Later on in chapter 11, in verses 12 through 13, and then also in 32 through 39, you see what God still does for His people. Look at 12 through 13 very quickly. We read that. I meant 32 through 39. But he shall have one tribe for the sake of my servant David, and for the sake of Jerusalem, the city that I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel, because they have forsaken me and worshipped Ashtaroth, the goddess of the Sidonians, Chemosh, the god of Moab, and Milcom, the god of Ammonites. And they have not walked in my ways, doing what is right in my sight, and keeping my statutes and my rules as David his father did. I will not take the whole kingdom out of his hand, but I will make him a ruler all the days of his life for the sake of David my servant, whom I have chosen. You see this kind of repeated from the first part of the chapter. But God made this commitment not because Solomon did right and followed God's statutes, but because God is gracious and He disciplines, but in a gracious way. And so that's another way for us to look at this. So from the story of Solomon, we can gather up these three major pieces. First of all, compromise rarely feels dangerous at first. You've probably been caught up in this before a lot. Like we started out, there's so many times where I'm compromising, but I only realize it in retrospect because it's such a small thing. So compromise rarely feels dangerous at first. If we make these concessions, if we compromise, the second piece is it often results in hardened hearts and in a slipping away. I kind of go back to what Jimmy was saying earlier. Results in a slipping away. Last of all, it is better to have less with purity than to have everything at the cost of loyalty to God. I think that was ultimately Solomon's lesson. Someone that started off with, I really don't want anything, God. I mean, God came to Solomon and said, what do you want? And Solomon said, I just want the ability to discern and help people. And then you fast forward all the way to chapter 11, and you get a totally different person. I mean, the guy has 1,000 women around him. First of all, who would want that? Secondly, he is such a change from where he came from, right? Chapter 3, he's literally like, all I want to do is make good decisions for the people. Chapter 11, I've got 1,000 women, right? What a change he has made.
Mackenzie,
Yeah, go ahead.
There's a couple of phrases there. heart was not wholly true to the Lord his God. That seems interesting, right? In the midst of all of this, all this sinfulness,
Yeah.
it seems like maybe he's still in an area of compromise. He's somehow convinced himself that he's still true to the Lord, maybe even in this situation.
Yeah.
Where he's doing all of these things. So, maybe he only compromised 5% to begin with. Now he's compromising 99%. But he's
Still got that 1%.
himself,
Yeah.
But I'm somewhat true to the Lord still.
Yeah. I think there's a sense of that in compromise and a lot of things that we do. Not every time we compromise, but a lot, where we're lying to ourselves, to your point. And what verse was that, Tim, that you were looking at?
It was in verse 4 and then again in verse 6.
Okay, verse 4 and verse 6. And his heart was not wholly true to the Lord his God, as was the heart of David his father, right? It wasn't 100% there. Maybe it was just a little bit. It's a really good point. I think we do that a lot of times. And the example I want to look at here in just a bit is a great example of that, where folks have found themselves in that situation. Let's actually flip over to that. Look at 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 6 and 7. Who remembers what all 1 Corinthians is about? It's about church, division, issues, problems. I mean, it's everywhere, right? And we get this bombshell right in the middle of chapter 5. Paul is writing to the Corinthian church here, and he wants them to do a lot of things, but one thing he wants them to do is get somebody out of there. And it's the situation that we're going to look at in verses 6 through 7. Let's pick up in verse 6. Paul says, "Your boasting is not good. Do you not know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump? Cleanse out the old leaven, that you may be a new lump, as you really are unleavened. For Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed." Okay, so that's kind of the key point, and really aligned with what's happening with Solomon in this situation. But look back at verse 1 of chapter 5 as to what's happening. I just want you to keep in mind what Paul writes in verses 6 through 7 about a little leaven leavening the whole lump. Kevin explained to us earlier what that means, and then I reiterated it in a really poor way because I don't know anything about baking bread. But we get what that means. Let's go back to verse 1. Paul says, "It's actually reported that there is sexual immorality among you, and of a kind that is not tolerated even among pagans. For a man has his father's wife, and you are arrogant. Ought you not rather to mourn? Let him who has done this be removed from among you. For though absent in body, I am present in spirit, and as if present, I have already announced judgment on the one who did such a thing. When you are assembled in the name of the Lord Jesus in my spirit and present with the power of our Lord Jesus, you are to deliver this man to Satan for the destruction of the flesh, so that his spirit may be saved in the day of the Lord." And then he goes into what we initially read here. Is this not a great example of what it means to compromise? Except in this situation, it's a whole congregation that has decided to compromise what they know is actually true. So Paul is probably alarming them and waking them up, shaking them and saying, hey, you have a sexually immoral person that everybody knows is sexually immoral, but no one wants to stand up. All of you are compromising on what you know is correct. No one wants to stand up and throw this person out. And don't you know it's for their own good that you throw this person out? That's the last part of what he's talking about here. That's one of the things I thought of when I thought about the situation with Solomon, is a lot of times we'll find ourselves in these situations, and it takes someone else from the outside to come in and shake us and say, you're in a compromised state right now. David Solomon didn't have a prophet like David did to come and speak to him, right? And Solomon didn't have a Paul, an apostle, to come and shake him and wake him up. But a lot of times we're blessed with agents like that. But I think it's a good lesson. Compromise isn't just at the individual level. One of the scariest things is when a whole group decides to compromise, like the Corinthian church. Paul warns here about tolerating one flagrant, unrepentant sin, because all it takes is just one sin. Now, this was a bad one, but all it takes is one sin to really cause damage across a whole group. So anyway, I thought that would be a good one. We'll close on this passage using Jesus' words. Jesus warns, "Watch and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees." And here he's referring to their hypocrisy and their false doctrine. But I thought it just tied really well with what we're talking about tonight in watching and being on guard. Any comments or questions from you all?
You would think out of 1,000 women, Solomon would have found one that believed in God.
Yeah, you would have.
He had everything, wisdom, wealth, women, everything he could want.
Yeah, I know. Maybe if he would have looked amongst God's people, he would have gotten that one out of 1,000. Yeah, that's true. That's true. New lumps. Thank you, Larry. That's our application. Any other questions or comments? All right, I bet there's cookies and beverages out in the foyer. Enjoy. Tim, will you be the entertainment later on tonight as well? Or okay. You're done. You're done. Yeah. All right. Well, we'll close it out there. Thank you all.